Welcome back, everybody, to Bio 2022 here in San Diego. I'm Greg Slobodkin, Editor-in-Chief of ScienceBoard.net, and I have the privilege of being here with Kathryn Schubert, who is CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research based in Washington, D.C. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is first of all, the mission of your organization, and can you sort of walk us through the history?
Sure. So SWHR was founded 30 years ago on the idea that women and minorities were not being included in clinical trials. And so while we have done a good job of that, we continue to work through promoting research on biological sex differences in disease and also improving women's health through our science, policy, and education programs.
Very good. And so you're here at the conference, you're participating in a panel, I think specifically on women's health issues, but also tied to health policy and what can be done to further, or shall I say, resolve inequities.
Yes, and it's a really important panel. I think it's one thing that we don't necessarily think of when we think of health equity these days is this intersectionality between sex and gender and race or ethnicity, geographic location. And so the conversation is really about how far we've come, but also how much further we have to go to really think about this integration of ideas and what we can do to make a change.
And so, generally, how would you lay out, what are the health inequities and disparities that exist in healthcare?
So there are a lot of them. I think for women, we often say there are historic health inequities in the structure of the system, but there's also inequities in terms of how women are treated generally throughout their touch points with the healthcare system. So thinking about a lack of inclusion in clinical trials from the beginning, women were thought of as little men. Thinking about this idea that women's issues are sort of a niche issue and that it's not something that should be incorporated into the mainstream system, but also thinking about stigma, as well as women not necessarily being listened to when they're bringing their health problems to their clinician.
On the issue of clinical trials, it's always amazing to me. Women constitute, 50% of the US population, so for them to not be represented in clinical trials seems absurd.
It seems very silly, and in fact, we have a long way to go. So we are doing better, as I mentioned. The FDA released its latest snapshot, and of its approved medications, up to 70% of the trial participants were women. So that's great. However, we just started tracking that in 2015, which is not that long ago. If you drill down deeper into that, it is mostly white women. So really thinking about subpopulations of women, as well as very specific populations like pregnant or lactating women are not included in most trials either. And so if you think about things like the COVID-19 vaccine, they were not included in the original clinical trials, and so there was a lot of confusion about whether or not it was safe or effective for them. It was, but we had to do a lot of backtracking in that. So it still continues to happen. We still fight to make sure that you can meet people where they are, you can include women in trials, but also think about the unique issues to them. It's not your traditional issues necessarily, but things like childcare, transportation. How do you make sure that women want to be participants in a trial versus just recruiting them as if you would recruit anyone else?
You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and were there specific issues that impacted women more so than men during the pandemic?
Yes. Women in particular bore a greater burden than men in terms of childcare, stress levels, being in the workforce and continuing to make sure that their children were being homeschooled or whatever it was you might see. Also dealing with aging parents as well. That's a significant issue for women. The other piece of this directly related to their health is that many women delayed their necessary screenings. So things like screenings for breast cancer or cervical cancer. We saw a huge issue with women waiting a year or 2 years from when they would normally get it. And so we're still feeling the effects of that and trying to understand what that's going to mean for the future.
And if we take a step back, COVID aside, are there other diseases in particular that impact women specifically as opposed to men?
Traditionally, we think of diseases like endometriosis, uterine fibroids, menopause, which is not a disease, but it is a life stage that women do go through, as your typical women's health issues. However, things like Alzheimer's disease, migraine, autoimmune conditions, those all disproportionately impact women as well.
Interesting. And so this panel that you're participating in, are there policy issues that you're coming to this panel with and saying, yes, these are the things that we're endorsing?
Yeah. Across the board, we need more women in science. So whether they're clinical trials participants, whether they are researchers, clinicians, all the way up to the top level of executives at companies or throughout the federal government here in the US, we need women at the table to be able to create these trial designs and really think about the specific issues women are looking at.
Interesting. And in terms of the panel, I mean, it's made up of different organizations. Is there sort of an agenda that your group brings to that panel as opposed to some of the others?
I think for us at SWHR, we've been really engaged in the advocacy side of things, so both on the patient side, but also the researcher and clinician side. And so really making sure that we're working to carry the message for women that we need to be empowered in our healthcare, that we all need to come together, work together with whether it's federal agencies or industry or researchers to really move the needle forward in women's health.
So we're here at Bio 2022 here in San Diego. Is there a specific message you have for biotech companies in particular as it relates to the issues that you're working on?
We need more women. I think it's really critical, exactly what I said. You have to build this in at all levels. And that doesn't mean, it's a perspective issue, right? So it also means allyship with men. It means men considering these issues that maybe weren't considered before. Sometimes we have to do things a little bit differently. I think this is evolving, but it is really critical that we integrate sex and gender issues into the lens of innovation in order to make progress.
And do you feel like some of the agencies, I mean, you mentioned FDA, do you feel like NIH, that they've given enough support to some of the issues that you've outlined here?
They're trying. Historically, women's health research has been underfunded and not prioritized across the federal government. SWHR was really critical in making sure that there were offices of women's health throughout the federal agencies, but that's only 30 years old, which isn't that old. So really thinking about how can we better prioritize women's health across the board. That doesn't just mean the things that I mentioned like endometriosis or uterine fibroids. It means looking at sex differences across disease states, thinking about the lifespan. So not just what's happening during your reproductive years, but what happens post-menopause. And really thinking about, again, how to integrate that across the board at the federal agencies so that it is a part, just as we would want women to be included across the board in biotech, we would want them to be included across the board at the federal level as well.
So final question, what's your major takeaway from the Biotech 2022 conference?
I've been really pleased by the conversation surrounding gender equity. I think it was highlighted predominantly in the keynote this morning. I think it's been highlighted across the board with the panel that I'm on. And it's heartening to see, and I think there's an openness and willingness to really think about what does this integration and inclusiveness mean when it comes to the intersectionality of women and health equity.
Well, Katie, thank you very much for your time, and I hope that these issues become more prominent and a lot of your agenda is taken seriously in Washington.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you. Join us for continuing coverage from Bio 2022 here in San Diego.